twin suns of Drixal beat down relentlessly on an ocean of ochre sands, their unyielding light bouncing off metallic dunes and bleaching the horizon into a pale blur. Every breath drawn on this planet felt dry, sharp, and heavy. Even the Tanax, creatures evolved to store moisture in their translucent gelatinous bodies, had begun to falter under Drixal's intensifying droughts. The Tanax had once thrived in small, tightly knit communities, scattered near sparse underground water pockets. Over the centuries, they had adapted to the planet's extreme conditions, relying on a combination of innate biological reserves and carefully rationed resources. But lately, even the elders could not remember a time when water had been so scarce. Pools that had lasted for generations now lay barren. The Tanakh leader, Izkel, spoke to his people from the sunlit gathering, stone, his voice a hollow echo over the empty basin. His message was grim. The planet's wells were running dry, and the survival of their species demanded drastic measures. In this dire moment, Izkel called for volunteers. Brave individuals were needed to venture into the uncharted deserts and search for water sources that, if legends held true, might still lie hidden beneath the sands. The mission was perilous and largely regarded as a one-way journey. Those chosen would receive the best available gear, rudimentary drilling tools, sun-resistant garments, and small rations of the remaining water, but no guarantees. Meanwhile, in a distant enclave, a lone human prospector named Jules Anders was taking stock of his equipment. Jules, a desert dweller by nature, had grown up on Earth's increasingly arid colonies. When the opportunity arose to sign on with the Tanax as a contractor, he jumped at the chance. Their technology, though seemingly simple, held secrets that Earth's engineers had long since forgotten. Jules had hoped that a few months on Drixal would yield him an artifact or two that could be sold for a tidy sum back home. But Drixal had not been kind to Jules. The deal with the Tanax was proving less lucrative than promised. They were protective of their technology, their culture, and even their time. Jules had been tasked with helping repair old drilling machines, a job well beneath his skill level, before a rogue sandstorm shredded the camp's protective canopies and buried half the equipment. The Tanax's frustration grew, and as water ran low, their tolerance for the human outsider shrank. When a call for volunteers went out, Jules didn't hesitate. If he couldn't earn their trust, perhaps he could prove himself in the wilderness. When he arrived at the rendezvous point, Jules found a group of Tanax assembling their gear, the Tanax who had signed on for the survival test were an eclectic bunch: a stoic elder named Veskel, a young idealist named Harrick, and two others who looked as though they'd rather be anywhere else. Jules stood out sharply. His sun-bleached, Earth-issued jumpsuit and patchwork survival pack screamed of foreign desperation. "Human," Veskel greeted him coolly. "You know what you're volunteering for." Jules grinned despite the heat. "I know how to dig. You need water?" "I can find water." Veskel regarded him for a moment. "We'll see if that's true. When you're in the dunes, digging is only the start." Their crawler, a rickety, sun-scorched vehicle retrofitted with a basic drilling platform, carried them deep into Drixal's uncharted territory. For days, the sand stretched endlessly and the sky offered no mercy. The air shimmered with heat, and the horizon seemed to mock them with mirages of shimmering lakes. Jules spent his time tinkering with the equipment, trying to improve the filtration units and conserve every precious drop. The Tanax, for their part, remained largely silent, focused on their instruments and the bleak journey ahead. But even Jules' earthborn survival instincts were no match for the unexpected. On the fourth day, as the crawler climbed a steep dune, a fierce windstorm erupted. It swept across the sands in minutes, blinding everyone in a golden haze. Jules shouted for the Tanax to hold on, but the storm grew too violent. The crawler's engines choked and stuttered. The vehicle bucked once, twice, and then gave out. Without warning, it toppled sideways and disappeared into the shifting dunes. Jules tumbled free and clawed his way out of the sand. He could hear muffled shouts, see blurry figures trying to climb back to the surface. But the storm didn't relent. One by one, the voices faded, and by the time the winds died down, Jules found himself utterly alone. The crawler was buried, the other volunteers nowhere in sight. He was stranded. When the sky cleared, Jules surveyed the wreckage. With no working vehicle, no clear sense of direction, and only the scant supplies on his back, he faced a decision. Wait and hope for rescue or start digging. The Tanax had always insisted the planet still held hidden water reserves. Jules tightened his sunscarf, gripped his hand drill, and made his choice. He wouldn't wait to die. He'd dig and prove to this desert that he wasn't ready to give up. The desert around Jules was an unbroken sea of rippling heat and silence. The only sound he heard as he began to dig was the rasp of his shovel against the hard-packed sand and the occasional sigh of the wind. His body, still battered from the storm and dehydrated from days of rationing water, moved on muscle memory. Dig, breathe, dig again. Jules had grown up on the edge of survival. Earth's deserts were not as fierce as Drixall's, but the principles were the same. You didn't waste a single drop, you didn't trust mirages, and you kept going, because the alternative wasn't an option. He began by scouting for clues, an odd patch of dampness beneath a shaded overhang, a stretch of ground that seemed cooler to the touch. But Drixall gave away no hints. The surface was dry as bone. Still, he remembered the Tanax speaking of their ancient wells, reservoirs fed by aquifers far beneath the dunes. If he could just dig deep enough, he might find the remnants of that underground water. The Tanax equipment was gone, but his hands and a rusted manual drill remained. That would have to be enough. He worked during the early morning and late evening, when the suns hung lower and the temperature dipped from unbearable to merely searing. His breaks consisted of small sips from his dwindling water supply and bites of a nutrient bar. He used his clothing to create makeshift shade, draping his jumpsuit's upper half over a pole fashioned from scavenged parts. The heat was unrelenting, and every movement drained more energy than it should have. As the days wore on, Jules began to hallucinate. The heat played tricks on his mind. Shimmering pools of water would appear just over the next dune, only to vanish when he approached. A few times he swore he heard voices, faint and echoing, as though the Tanax were calling him from far away. He didn't know if it was his determination or sheer stubbornness, but he refused to stop. If there was any chance of survival, it lay in the sand beneath his feet. Then, after what felt like an eternity, his spade struck something different. The sound wasn't the dull scrape of sand or rock, but a hollow, almost muffled thud. Jules froze. He pulled the shovel back and pushed his hands into the hole he'd made. It felt cooler there. He dug faster, dirt flying over his shoulders in a frenzy. When he saw the faint glimmer of moisture, his heart leapt. His fingers were shaking as he worked the loose sand away. Soon a muddy trickle began to seep into the hole. It wasn't much, just a slow, sluggish ooze of water, but to Jules it was a miracle. He cupped his hands and let the liquid pool in them before bringing it to his parched lips. It tasted metallic, mineral heavy, but it was life. Once his thirst was slaked, the real work began. A shallow puddle wasn't enough. If this water had been hiding here, there had to be more. He widened the hole, fashioned a crude filter from a scrap of fabric and a section of hose, and started digging deeper. With each passing day, the trickle grew stronger. What began as a muddy seep turned into a steady, thin flow. Jules knew he had hit an ancient pocket, a leftover reserve from Drixall's forgotten past. The small well became his lifeline. He rationed the water carefully, drinking only what was necessary, and using the rest to keep himself alert. For the first time in weeks, his body began to recover. He could think clearly again, plan his next steps, but more than that, the well represented something Jules hadn't felt in a long time: hope. The transformation of Jules' well from a mere survival tool into a thriving oasis began quietly. After all, at first no one else knew he'd struck water. Alone in the desert, Jules spent the days expanding the hole, lining it with fragments of metal and rock to prevent it from collapsing, and constructing a crude filtration system from parts salvaged from his crawler. The trickle of water grew into a steady flow, cool and clear, dripping into a collection basin he dug nearby. Each drop felt like a triumph. He wasn't the only one struggling under the brutal suns. Somewhere, he knew, the Tanaks were still out, there, wandering the desert in search of what he'd just found. They might not have been kind to him before, but Jules wasn't one to hold grudges, especially when mutual survival was on the line. His signal beacon, built from the crawler's emergency transponder, had been running since the storm cleared. It took several more days of hard work before the faint hum of an approaching scout vessel broke the silence. The Tanaks arrived cautiously, their strange, translucent bodies rippling in the heat. At first they didn't believe him. A human, someone they had left for dead, standing next to a well in the middle of the wastelands. Preposterous. Jules didn't say much. Instead, he crouched, filled an improvised canteen, and handed it to the nearest Tanak. The elder Veskal stared at the liquid in disbelief before tasting it. The other Tanaks watched as Veskal's gelatinous skin regained its usual sheen. That single sip seemed to revive the weary alien in an instant. What followed was a flurry of rapid conversation in their strange musical language. Jules didn't understand much of it yet, but he got the gist. They needed more. He nodded, motioning to the well and gesturing that they could take what they needed. After all, he'd seen how bad they'd looked. If he could help them, maybe he could also secure some resources of his own. At first, the exchanges were simple. The Tanaks brought small gifts, pieces of discarded machinery, fragments of alien alloys, and occasional bundles of desert fruits Jules didn't recognize. In return, Jules let them fill their containers from his well. Over time, more Tanaks began to arrive. News of the water source spread quickly. What had started as a lone survivalist's gamble turned into a bustling outpost. Jules adapted. He expanded his filtration setup using some of the alien tech to improve efficiency. He built better shade structures and carved out trenches to prevent overflow. The well's output increased, allowing more Tanaks to gather at the oasis. Jules didn't exploit them. He knew that building goodwill was more valuable than hoarding wealth on a planet where everything was scarce. As his operation grew, so did his network of contacts. The Tanaks who came to him brought not only supplies but stories. Jules learned more about their culture, their history, and the ancient water sources they had once relied on. With each encounter, he picked up words and phrases in their language, gradually earning their trust. The barriers between them started to dissolve. He was no longer just the human to them. He was becoming part of their community. From these exchanges, Jules began to understand the potential of his new role. The water wasn't just a commodity. It was the lifeblood of this harsh planet. If he could continue to refine his setup and gather more advanced materials, he might even help revive the surrounding area. Small green algae farms, an essential food source for the Tanaks, started to spring up near the well. The once barren sands showed the faintest signs of life. By the time Jules found himself looking out at the growing settlement around his well, he realized he had done more than survive. He'd created something new on Drixal, a chance for renewal, both for himself and for the Tanaks. The well had become a center of hope, and Jules, an outsider who had been left for dead, was now at its heart. What began as a single-man struggle for survival blossomed into a hub of rejuvenation. Jules' well became the focal point of a growing community, and the barren sands around it started to pulse with activity. More and more Tanaks arrived. Each day their translucent forms no longer dulled by dehydration. They carried whatever they could spare, bits of technology, tools, and strange biological materials, to trade for the precious water. Jules, true to his roots as a resourceful prospector, turned each exchange into an opportunity. Over time, Jules transformed the patch of desert into something more stable. He took the alien components the Tanaks considered scrap and built a fully functional pumping system. The well no longer depended on his manual labor. Instead, water flowed steadily through a network of makeshift pipes into storage tanks. This allowed him to dig even deeper, tapping into larger subterranean reservoirs. With a secure and growing water supply, the Tanaks began to thrive. Their homes, previously scattered and temporary, became more permanent. Structures made of hardened desert resin and lightweight alloys rose from the sands, forming a small village around the well. Jules became a key figure in this newfound settlement. Though he started as an outsider, his ingenuity earned him the Tanak's respect. He learned their language slowly, picking up new words and gestures every day. The Tanaks, in turn, began to teach him their ways. They showed him how to cultivate the hardy algae that served as their primary food source. And Jules quickly realized that with a steady water supply, these algae farms could expand and diversify. The well's success wasn't just about the water. It was about what the water allowed. For the first time in generations, the Tanaks could think beyond survival. They could plan for the future. Children who had once grown up knowing only constant thirst played in the shade of the makeshift buildings, their translucent bodies vibrant and strong. Tanak elders, whose frail forms had struggled to maintain moisture, now walked tall, their bodies shimmering with newfound vitality. But Jules wasn't content to stop there. With the technology he'd salvaged and traded for, he began to improve the well's infrastructure. He installed filters that could remove more impurities and pumps that could push water farther into the desert. His long-term goal was to create a network of smaller wells, linking them with underground pipelines. If successful, the oasis he had created might one day expand into an entire region of fertile land. The Tanaks, inspired by Jules's vision, began to participate actively. They used their knowledge of Dryksol's unique ecosystem to suggest drilling sites and shared techniques for maintaining soil moisture. Together they developed irrigation systems and started growing more substantial crops. These small farms provided food not only for the local settlement, but also for travelers from distant parts of the planet. For the first time, trade caravans began arriving from other Tanak enclaves. Dryksol's harsh economy, once dictated solely by survival, started to include markets for goods and knowledge. Jules, who had once thought he'd be lucky just to escape the desert alive, found himself at the center of a budding civilization. He didn't see himself as a leader, but as someone who had sparked a change. The Tanaks took what he had started and made it their own, building a culture of collaboration and hope. In turn, they taught him resilience and a respect for the delicate balance of life on this unforgiving planet. As the sun set one evening, casting long shadows across the village, Jules stood by the well and watched the community he'd helped create. Tanak children ran past him, their laughter ringing in the warm dusk. A group of elders shared stories beneath a canopy of resin and cloth. Algae farms glowed faintly in the dimming light, their green hues a promise of sustenance and renewal. Jules knew that there were still challenges ahead. Dryksol was a brutal planet, and its environment could change at any moment. But for now he was content to see that life was thriving, where once there had been only death and dust. The well had been a lifeline for him, and now it was a lifeline for an entire world.